James Taylor, of course, and right now, here with us on the Heart of the East End, Jeffrey Sussman, the author of Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science, Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, and a professor at NYU School for Social Research. Good morning, Mr. Sussman, and welcome back to the program.
It's always a pleasure to be on with you.
Oh my gosh, I had such a nice time with you and Carl the last time you were in the studio. So nice, I played it twice, and therefore...
Oh, isn't that wonderful? Thank you.
And therefore it went 4 times. Now, unfortunately, the hook for our interview is not a happy one. So this, after, a month ago, we had a Jewish grocery store in Jersey City as the target of an anti-Semitic hate crime. It looks like authorities are finally calling a spade when they say domestic terrorism. I'm curious, as a person of that faith, what has it been like for you these past few years with these mass shootings?
Well, my background is that of a Jew, and because of that, I've always been very aware of anti-Semitism. I never felt particularly Jewish except when I was involved in or the target of anti-Semitism. And when I wrote my book, Max Baer and Barney Ross, I was dealing with a period in American history during the 1920s and 1930s when anti-Semitism was rife in this country. And the events that have occurred over the past month or so reminded me very much of what was going on in the United States in the 1920s and 1930s.
Well, really, it's been a couple years now, because the last month there was that shooting at the synagogue last year. Right.
Yeah, I mean, there have been a lot of vicious attacks against Hasidic Jews who are obvious to the general public because of their appearance. Mm-hmm. Secular Jews have not been attacked, especially unless they are in a place like a synagogue, because they're not visible to anti-Semites. But Hasidic Jews are very visible, and therefore they're the likely targets of anti-Semites. And having spent a lot of time doing research for my book about Max Baer and Barney Ross, I became intensely aware of how anti-Semitism was playing out in America in the 1920s and 1930s. And there's an element of that that's coming back. What's also...
before you go, let's talk about that element. What was it that people were experiencing in the 20s and 30s in New York City?
Well, there was a tremendous amount of nationalism, which is also becoming very popular again. And when you stress nationalism, you tend to stress the perfection of your own country and your own people and so forth, and anything that is exotic or different doesn't fit into the theory of nationalism. And nationalism
not to be confused with patriotism.
Exactly.
Right.
And nationalism was growing in intensity in the 20s and 30s and reached its apogee in Germany with Nazism, which is the height of nationalism. And now we're experiencing a kind of nationalistic drift in this country as well, and that's brought out anti-Semites in various stripes, so that in Charlottesville we had marchers going down the street saying things like, Jews are not going to replace us. And
what does that even mean?
It means, in effect, that we want to get rid of Jews. We don't want Jews around. We don't want them competing for our jobs. We don't want them competing for positions in school, for positions in government. We don't want them here. And basically, that's what the Nazis were saying. We don't want Jews here. And during the 1920s, Henry Ford, the creator of the Ford automobile, was publishing a newspaper called The Independent, and every week he criticized Jews and wanted them out of the country.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, he's the only American who is mentioned in Mein Kampf as a hero of Adolf Hitler.
I did not know that.
Yes, and he was eventually sued for slandering a lot of Jews.
My gosh.
But it became so vicious that the famous folk singer Woody Guthrie wrote a song about him, and I'll just repeat one of the lines from it. It says, "Yonder." Well, this was actually about a Catholic priest named Father Coughlin, who was also talking about how the Jews should be gotten rid of in America, that they shouldn't be here anymore. And he became an advocate for both Hitler and Mussolini. And Woody Guthrie wrote the following lines. He wrote, "Yonder comes Father Coughlin wearing the silver chain, gas on the stomach and Hitler on the brain."
What is that song called?
Excuse me?
What do you know the title of that track?
I don't know what the title of the track is, but it's from a song that Woody Guthrie wrote in response to the rising tide of anti-Semitism in the United States, and he wrote against the advocates of anti-Semitism, particularly Father Coughlin and Henry Ford, and then later the famous aviator Charles Lindbergh, who received a special medal from Hermann Goering for being an advocate on behalf of Nazi Germany.
What about Walt Disney?
Walt Disney had a reputation of being an anti-Semite, but it was sort of below the radar. I mean, he wasn't producing movies or anything like that.
He did
portrayed Jews.
Disney did The Education for Death, I think it is. It's a very little known Disney production that deals very directly with not the Nazism and Hitler. It's called The Education for Death.
Really, I never knew about that.
Yeah, I'll share it with you sometime. But yeah, you can look it up. But let's get into your book. Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing. Now, this rise of nationalistic behaviors in the 20s and 30s in New York City, do you think this had something to do with Max Baer and or Barney Ross becoming fighters?
Well, it certainly played a very large part in their roles as professional prize fighters, so that when Hitler came to power in 1933, excuse me, he was very happy to have Max Schmeling, his favorite athlete and favorite boxer, come to New York and show the superiority of the Aryan race. And to do that, he was going to fight Max Baer, who was partially Jewish. But when Max Baer's manager told Max Baer what the Nazis intended to do with the Jews, Max Baer became deeply incensed by this. And though he didn't particularly identify as a Jew, he wanted to show what he thought of the German attitude towards the Jews. And so he had a Jewish star sewn onto his boxing trunks. And he was engaged to fight Max Schmeling at Yankee Stadium in 1933. And 60,000 fans went to that fight. My father was one of them.
Oh, wow.
And he said there were probably 30,000 Jews in the stands. And when they saw Max Baer take off his robe and reveal the Jewish star on his trunks,
oh my gosh,
they all cheered him. And from another contingent called the American German Bund movement, there was a lot of hissing and boos when Max Baer revealed the Jewish star on his trunks. And from the beginning of the fight, Max Baer came out like a tiger, and he absolutely pummeled Max Schmeling, almost killing him. And this went on for 10 rounds. And in the 10th round, finally, the referee had to stop the fight because he thought that Max Schmeling would be killed by Max Baer.
Right.
And when Max Baer was declared the winner, all the Jews in the stadium stood up and cheered. They finally had a hero who had beaten a symbol of Nazism, and it made them feel terrific.
Was he Little Hebrew?
Excuse me?
Was he Little Hebrew? Or was that Barney?
No. Barney Ross was a smaller fighter. Max Baer was the only Jewish heavyweight champion of the 20th century.
And Max was the one who did kill a couple opponents?
Max Baer, in one of his early fights, killed a fighter named...
he was a hard hitter.
A very hard hitter.
Yeah.
Jack Dempsey said that Max Baer had the hardest right hand, the hardest right punch of any fighter in the 20th century.
Wow.
And in his sixth fight, he accidentally killed an opponent named Frankie Campbell, and he felt so badly about it that he didn't fight for 6 months thereafter. And then for his next 6 fights, he donated all the money he earned from those fights to Max Campbell's widow, and he set up trust funds for Frankie Campbell's children to pay for their college educations.
Right.
So he had a very strong conscience about what was right and what was wrong.
It's got to be so tough. Especially we also talked about that was the same case as who was it? That was the he was just a total pawn, and then
Primo Carnera.
Yes, Primo Carnera, and the fighter that refused to take a dive and beat him really viciously, and then not only set him up as a professional wrestler, but took care of all of his medical fees.
But I mean, Max Baer was a very, very good person. He was very kind and very generous to his opponents, and very beloved by them. And when he died, all of his pallbearers were former heavyweight boxers whom he had fought.
And that's unbelievable. So definitely a Jewish hero of boxing. And Barney Ross, I guess that brings us to Little Hebrew.
Barney Ross was an interesting man. His father was a rabbi who and they lived in a very poor section of Chicago, and his father was killed during a holdup, and Barney Ross began associating with a gang of young delinquents. He lost all of his interest in religion and in God after what happened to his father, and eventually he and his close friend, a man named Jacob Rubenstein, who we later came to know as Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oh, wow.
They were in a gang of delinquents in Chicago, and eventually they became bookie runners for Al Capone. And Al Capone took a special interest in Barney Ross because after Barney's father was killed, his mother had a nervous breakdown, and he was separated from his 3 siblings. All were put into foster care.
Oh, my gosh.
And Al Capone felt sorry for him. I mean, he was a vicious gangster who felt very paternalistic to this young man. And he said to Barney Ross, he said to him, you don't have the makings of being a gangster. It's not for you, but you could be a prize fighter. I've seen you in these street fights, and you do very, very well. And he arranged for Barney Ross to have a trainer, and when Barney Ross became a professional fighter, Al Capone made sure that all the tickets to his fights were paid for, because Barney Ross got a portion of those tickets, of the sale of those tickets, and he was able to use that money to buy a house, get his mother out of a mental institution, and get his siblings out of foster care, and reunite his family.
That's a really unusual story for these boxers. They often retired with nothing.
Right, and he was still a young man, and he he was the first fighter to hold three titles simultaneously: lightweight, super lightweight, and welterweight.
Like featherweight? Is that what the super light?
Featherweight would be one lower than lightweight.
Okay.
And there was another fighter at that time named Jimmy McLarnin, who had an anti-Semitic manager named Pop Foster. And Jimmy McLarnin had beaten 6 Jewish fighters, and as a result of that, he was known as a Jew killer. And this was during, in the 1930s when anti-Semitism was extremely popular in the country.
So then a fight against Barney Ross would have been, a big promotional to-do.
Right, exactly. So this was promoted as a fight between a Jew and an anti-Semite. Mm-hmm. And there were a trilogy of fights. And in the first one, Barney Ross beat Jimmy McLarnin. And in the second one, Jimmy McLarnin beat Barney Ross. And in the third one, Barney Ross beat Jimmy McLarnin. However, Pop Foster felt that the judges had favored Barney Ross during the third fight, and he went to court to try to get the decision overturned.
Stop
and,
it.
And one of the things he said to the judge in this case was that Jack Dempsey, who was a referee in the fight, had a Jewish grandmother, and therefore he was biased against his fighter. And the judge said to him, "Are you kidding? You must be crazy." And he threw the case out of court. Mm-hmm. And Barney Ross had an interesting career after his boxing career ended.
Was he kicking back some of his purse to Capone? I mean, what was the relationship like there?
He may have been. We don't know about that. But Capone was betting heavily on Barney Ross, and Barney Ross delivered for him. I mean, Barney Ross had one win after another. I mean, it was unusual for a fighter to be able to have 3 titles simultaneously.
Do you ever think about that when you consider the the whole history between the connection between the mafia and boxing and the fixing of fights? Do you ever think about Barney Ross's, some of his fights being fixed?
I don't think so. Barney Ross was a very formidable character, and in the 1930s, that was before men like Frankie Carbo and Blinky Palermo, who controlled the welterweight and middleweight divisions, and they were the gatekeepers for whoever could become a champion. In the 1930s, it was really the heavyweight division where there were a lot of fixed fights regarding, someone like Primo Carnera, and they were all controlled by a man named Oni Madden, who owned the contract of Primo Carnera. So I don't think that Barney Ross's fights were fixed. He also beat a very well-known fighter at the time named Tony Canzoneri, and Tony Canzoneri, it turned out, we learned later on, was actually a member of a mafia family. And so if they wanted to fix a fight, he would be a likely candidate because they had the power and the muscle to fix that fight, and yet it wasn't fixed. Barney Ross beat Tony twice, and there was no dispute about it.
Well, I hate to get away from this topic because it really is very important. And, obviously it's a terrible thing, and we hope that they will stop. But, I am curious because you are researching your new book, which is a little more general than Boxing and the Mob, just about, what is it? Is it just about the history of the mafia in New York City? It
is a story about the rise and decline of the mafia in New York City from 1918 up through the end of the 20th century. And I've gotten some wonderful stories, and I have spoken to numerous criminal defense attorneys, including your friend Joe Giannini, who gave me some wonderful insights into defending the mob. And I spoke to other criminal defense attorneys and to prosecutors and investigators. And have
you been able to get some first-person stuff?
Oh yes, I have gotten. I've spoken to a number of old mobsters, men who are in their 80s and 90s, who have recounted some wonderful stories to me.
It must be just such a cool thing to hear these stories, because they're often larger than life.
What was interesting was I spoke to two criminal defense attorneys, and I spoke to them, oddly enough, because of that new movie, The Irishman.
Right.
And both of them told me that the story of The Irishman, as told in the movie, is completely false. That the protagonist, I think his name is Frank Sheeran, he didn't kill Jimmy Hoffa. And from the book that I just finished writing, I know for a fact that he didn't kill Joey Gallo, also known as Crazy Joey Gallo. And all of this is really pure fiction.
So who did?
Well, according to Jack Goldsmith, who is the stepson of a man named Chucky O'Brien, who was Jimmy Hoffa's unofficial stepson, the FBI knows who actually killed Jimmy Hoffa, but they've never revealed the information because it isn't 100% certain, and they have a rule of not revealing who a murderer is until they have all the evidence. But they have about 90% of the evidence, and it was a man from a Detroit mafia family, and he died last January.
Oh wow!
And they're pretty certain that he was the shooter, and that the contract to kill Jimmy Hoffa was initiated by a man named Tony Provenzano, or Tony Pro, who was a Teamster and gang leader from New Jersey, and also a man named Jack Alone, who was the mafia boss of Detroit, and they were the two people who initiated the contract to murder Jimmy Hoffa.
Why Detroit?
Well, that's where the Teamsters were, and that's where Jimmy Hoffa was based when he was head of the Teamsters Union, and that's where the auto industry had been primarily.
Right, which brings us back to Ford again. So we are getting close to NPR News at the top of the hour here. I have to say, I'm so excited for you to come back. And I'm also really excited about just 2020 and all of the things that, not only that I can learn from you about boxing and whatnot, but about marketing and PR. And I just want to thank you for the little note about setting up press releases and whatnot for the show.
Oh, I'd love to do that. I'd love to help you because I think your show is terrific, and I think we should issue press releases on a regular basis to let the world know exactly what you're doing.
I agree with you. I agree. So thank you so much, Jeffrey Sussman. Where can I direct people as far as your books or anything is concerned?
Well, my email address is marketingpro@AOL.com, but all of my books are on Amazon.com. Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing, Rocky Graziano, Fists, Fame, and Fortune, and Boxing and the Mob, The Notorious History of the Sweet Science. Which
I can say is very good. I definitely just read it just a few weeks ago.
I know. And it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us on the Heart of the East End on WPPB. We'll speak soon.
Good.
All right. Take care.
You too.
All right. So We've got a few minutes left before NPR News at the top of the hour here on the Heart of the East End, the morning programming on WPPB, Long Island's only local NPR station, heard online around the world at 883WPPB.org or through the TuneIn Radio app, which you can download for free on any smart device that you have. I'm going from new eyes to zoo eyes. Aldous Harding, we're staying in the 2019 year, and then little Taj Mahal, Lovin' in My Baby's Eyes. That'll bring us from the eyes to the lovin' section of the set list, which is very appropriate because I was absolutely loving my conversation with Jeff Sussman here on Peconic Public Broadcasting. Beautiful song, Always Loving You, from James O'Malley's 2003 record, and I'm ready. I'm ready to say hello to Larry Maslon, one of our very own here at WPPB. You can hear Broadway to Main Street, 3 p.m. right here on 88.3 FM or online at 883WPPB.org, or you can meet Mr. Maslon himself this Saturday at 4 at Bookhampton in East Hampton. Is that right, Mr. Maslon?
You couldn't be more accurate, except you can call me Larry.
Oh, Larry. I would love to do that. So yeah. I am a big fan of your program, as I'm a big fan of the music of Broadway, and you're coming to us live from Broadway right now.
Yes, I'm actually in New York City, way up in my eyrie, looking over
nice.
Broadway and Astor Place. So, as you say, this Saturday we're going to be at Bookhampton, so we're going, which is on Main Street. So we're going literally from Broadway to Main Street.
Oh, that's cool.
This Saturday at 4:00, and I'm thrilled that we're starting our 9th year on the air on WPPB, our show every Sunday at 3.
Yay.
We just won the ASCAP Foundation Award.
Very nice.
For Best Radio Broadcast in America of any kind.
Stop it.
So, yep.
That's huge.
Yep.
Congratulations.
So, thank you.
And and now it's a book. Broadway to Main Street.
It was a book that came out last year in October.
Okay.
And I'm going to have that book, but 2 weeks ago, as we often do, we do some interviews on our show, and I interviewed Amanda Vale, who's a prize-winning author who just put together this amazing collage, really, of Jerome Robbins' writings and memorandums and stage directions and stuff, called Jerome Robbins by Myself, which is published by Knopf, and we did an interview on the air, and it was so exciting that Bookhampton asked us to kind of reprise our performance, and Amanda is going to join me at Bookhampton on Saturday. So if you like Jerome Robbins, who directed and choreographed On the Town, Gypsy, Fiddler on the Roof, West Side Story, which is in the news so much these days, and as well as being a major choreographer for the American Ballet Theater, and a former East Ender. He used to have a house, I think, in Watermill.
Stop it.
So you'll want to come and listen to us chat for an hour about
cool
this amazing
is that?
guy.
I'm gonna have to pitch this story to the Independent, because this is great.
Well, so many. That's one of the things that Wally Smith, our general manager, said when I started the show 9 years ago, is, of course, and I hope some of them are your listeners right now, the East End has always been so hospitable to people from Broadway.
Totally.
And, Sheldon Harnick still lives in East Hampton, and Bob Fosse and Gwen Verdon lived in Quogue, I think.
Right.
And Jerry Robbins lived in Watermill, and millions of other people.
That's true.
Not millions, hundreds.
Well, yeah, we don't have millions. We don't have space for millions, but, you know, in our hearts we can house more, right?
Right.
That is unbelievable. So that you took my question, because I was going to ask you for you to talk a little bit about Jerome Robbins. So instead, let me ask you how you met Amanda Vale.
That's an interesting story. Amanda Vale and I were like these two satellites that were doing kind of independent stuff. She had done a documentary for American Masters on Jerome Robbins about 12 years ago, and I had done a documentary for PBS, a 6-hour documentary called Make 'Em Laugh, The Funny Business of America, and which is a history of American comedy, and we were both nominated for Emmys the same year in the same category.
How cool.
and we saw each other's work. We sort of admired each other from afar. And then I remember going to a cocktail party at the Motion Picture Academy in Beverly Hills with Kathy Griffin. The three of us were talking, and we met each other over cocktails.
How cool is that?
And we became fast friends ever since. And I don't know. The story has many tales. I followed her work. She followed mine. But then her son, Patrick Vale, applied to the program I teach at, graduate acting at New York University. Right. He got in the program. He graduated, and he is currently playing Judd in this award-winning production of Oklahoma on Broadway.
Yeah, I have definitely heard Patrick Vale's name.
Yeah.
And I thought it was so funny because I just had Jeffrey Sussman on, and you're both NYU professors.
Right.
So I ended up making a little post for the Gram saying, it was a very NYU morning on the heart of the East End.
Awesome.
So that's really exciting. Again, guys, Lawrence Maslon, our illustrious host of Broadway to Main Street, 3 p.m. right here on WPPB on Sundays. You can see with Amanda Vale at Bookhampton in East Hampton this Saturday at 4 p.m. So how will it be structured? This event?
Well, we've Amanda and I, since that fateful day at the Academy, have done a ton of presentations together. I interview her when she has a book comes out. She interviews me when I have a book that comes out. And so we're just going to have a kind of free-flowing format and discuss Jerome Robbins' personal life, which is extraordinary, and his career, which is extraordinary, because she's unearthed this incredible cachet of letters and drawings even that he did, and diary entries, and it's really changed up our knowledge. I mean, Jerome Robbins was not a shrinking violet, but
still, letters are incredibly revealing, especially when you're a public figure. It seems like it doesn't make sense, but often public figures have a larger private side that you might not know.
Exactly, and even has a lot of his diary entries.
Oh, cool.
And those are pretty. Those deal with a lot of other people that the audience might be interested in. Arthur Lawrence, who lived out in Quogue, Leonard Bernstein, Stephen Sondheim, George Balanchine, Comden and Green. So a lot of famous people in that cast in that larger net as well. So if people dig the arts, this is the place to be.
This is a can't
Saturday.
Miss. Can't miss.
I would say you can say that.
I can,
say
and
that.
I will.
I can't say that.
Although I must miss, but only because I have to visit family. Otherwise, that is exactly where I would be, which is Bookhampton, 4 p.m. East Hampton.
Yes, and you said this magic word Gram.
Yes, the Gram.
And we just started Broadway to Main Street on Instagram this week.
Oh, congratulations. So
I caught up with the 21st century. Broadway to Main Street, one word.
Because I was looking for you.
Yeah.
I was looking for you, so I will replace that on the Gram post. And speaking of the Academy, you talked a little bit before. I asked Jeffrey Sussman an off-topic question. So I've got one for you. Yeah. And I don't know if you'll share it because I don't know how you work, but I'm curious about how you felt about Joker, if you've seen it, and what you thought of that film.
Wow, what a great question. Well, I actually wrote a documentary for PBS, a 3-hour documentary.
I love that you do so many documentaries for PBS. May I help sometime?
Sure.
Awesome. Okay, go ahead.
This one in 2014 was called Superheroes, A Never-Ending Battle. So comic books and superheroes is the other thing I'm passionate about.
Excellent.
And I had problems with Joker. I thought that it was I'm old enough to have watched it on television in the 60s when it came out. But the Joker in my mind was not only deranged, but he was a criminal mastermind. He was smarter than everyone. And I thought this movie went to a dark place, which I understand in 2019, but it stayed in the dark place for so long that I had trouble I had trouble sort of enjoying it. I mean, I think that's the bottom line. People
I have to imagine.
Like it.
Yeah, I have to imagine if you're also a big superhero fan and you're thinking about it from the DC Batman universe point of view. Because I had a great discussion with a fellow, and I hate to call you a nerd, but a fellow.
No, please.
Okay, a fellow nerd who was speaking
fanboy.
Yes, a fellow fanboy who was speaking to another who said, they were having similar issues with inconsistencies with the Joker. And he said, if you notice, it's called Joker, and that he felt like this was more of a comment on mental health, and he said, if you remove the Batman element of it, you might be able to appreciate it more. I personally, I thought the film was fantastic. Soundtracks are big for me, as I imagine they are for you. So the soundtrack for me was unbelievable. I loved the muted colors, and so the palette and the cinematography. Of course, the acting was phenomenal. But I thought it was really interesting comment on society and mental health and how people fall through the cracks and class divide, all sorts of stuff. It was more of a piece of art than a film. It was really not a superhero movie.
No, and I get that, and I'll give you two sort of musical theater references. Jerry Herman, who died right a day after Christmas, we did a show about him, did a musical in the 70s, and it got panned, and the New York Times said, I walked into the show humming the tunes, meaning that they were sort of like derivative. And I sort of felt, like been there, done that.
Right.
And I sort of felt a little in terms of, again, maybe it's a generational thing, having grown up with Taxi Driver, seeing it the day it came out and stuff. I sort of thought Taxi Driver handled that issue like a million times better. And then I also felt in terms of, it does have an awesome soundtrack, but again, as a show tune nerd, fanboy, when they played Send in the Clowns at the end of the movie. Oh, yeah. In a rendition by Frank Sinatra that I happen to love. I think it's one of the greatest versions ever, and I've written about it. I was like, oh, man, really? Can't you leave poor Send in the Clowns alone?
And there was someone was saying they had a problem with moving from, apparently this comes from The Dark Knight Returns, and that there was the scene where I can't talk about it. Never mind, I don't want to. Right. Spoilers.
Spoiler alert. Yeah, but there was a lot of good, but there, if you like that kind of thing.
I caught myself. Good.
For the movie, I would suggest if you're kind of a pop culture geek, is Dolomite Is My Name, with Eddie Murphy, which is on Netflix.
Ooh,
and I think Eddie Murphy was robbed by not getting an Academy Award nomination.
Like Samuel L. Jackson and Pulp Fiction?
Even more than that, because Eddie...
Really?
This is Eddie's big comeback, and it's all him, and he combines that kind of crazy edge that we loved he had in the 80s, and he's just deepened himself as an actor. And the story is such an interesting slice of Americana about the blaxploitation film and the self-made guy who tries to stand up to Hollywood. It would make an excellent double feature with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Okay, so now I've got to ask, because you mentioned blaxploitation, what did you think of Jackie Brown, the Quentin Tarantino film?
Oh God, that was so long ago. I'd have to refresh my memory.
Please do.
Pass.
Can you but just watch it again, just because it's one of my favorites, and I want to find something that we love together so we can love it together.
Awesome.
But I will
Dolomite.
say, you know what? I'm going to check that out, and you check mine out, and everyone who's listening, please do go to Bookhampton in East Hampton this Saturday at 4 and check out Larry Maslon himself with herself, remind me of her name. Amanda Vale, talking Jerome Robbins, and we'll have. But she has a book as well, correct?
That's her book. Yeah, we're sort of celebrating her book, but my book is also on sale
because
there. I need to refinish my kitchen, and
nice.
There's nothing too cheap for me. But if you like musical theater, even if you know a little bit about Jerome Robbins, the scope we're going to cover is so wide. I think a lot of people will kind of dig our conversation.
Oh my gosh. I wish I were there. I were going to be there, but I will be there. I will be there in spirit. And
Great.
I can't thank you enough for giving me a call and joining us on the Heart of the East End this morning.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Take care.
You too.